On you, the surroundings get smaller. You start to be treated more and more like an object by others. Your capacity for situational observation and participation. The difficulty of observing others when they are observing you lessens all of that. Hollywood used to think he was the coldest Sundance kid they had ever seen. Millions of fans adore this screen legend, a manly figure. People believed he had everything: an enduring career, fame, and power. However, at the age of 89, shortly before his death, Robert Redford was unable to disguise what he had done all of his life. A heart weighed down by the wounds of love. Numerous heartbreaks were hidden behind the beautiful grin. Obsessions that never went away were hidden behind the serene gaze. Although he made sacrifices, he was once praised. Sacrificed love and family in order to maintain the spotlight. Then those 8 women appear, not as short-lived Hollywood celebrities, but as tidbits of a personal life that Robert Redford never gave away. Before we look back together at the real journey of his love, if you are still grieving over his departure, please write or leave a like in honor of this legend. Before Robert Redford became a worldwide celebrity and Hollywood ever saw those sharp eyes on the big screen, Lola Van Vogenen was a woman who silently held his hand during the most uncertain years of his life. A quiet, perceptive historian, Lola Van Vogenen was not a shining star or a movie star. She was, nevertheless, the first to accept Robert Redford's dream. In 1958, when he was still having trouble making a name for himself as an actor, they got married. Just 2 young people putting their trust in one another. No extravagant wedding gown, no media hysteria. As well as later on, in the midst of adversity, she created a stable home by giving him 4 children. She stayed by Robert Redford's side without protest or demand when he landed his first Broadway part and gradually made his way into television and movies. Before the world knew his name, she was the sole place of calm on which he stood. But then there was a loud call from Hollywood. Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid made their debut and went viral in 1969. In just one movie, Robert Redford rose to fame. Everything sped up from there. 1972's The Candidate. 1973's The Sting. 1973's The Way We Were. 1975's 3 Days of the Condor. 1970 SIXS, All the President's Men. Success following success, bringing him to the heights of A-list fame, where he stood side by side with Dustin Hoffman and Paul Newman. Yet the more he excelled on film, the less he shined at home. Robert Redford was always on the go during his prime, from political campaigns to the Cannes Film Festival. The woman who used to hold his hand in the dark, Lola Van Vogenen, was now living in silence in her husband's shadow. She attempted to be the wife in the background, raise the kids, and maintain the family image. However, the lighting destroys intimacy. It is not warm. It resulted in empty family dinners and a father's long-distance phone call on children's birthdays. They got a divorce in 1985. No loud resentment, no tabloid brawls, just a gap that had become too great to overcome. Lola Van Vogenen was never disparaged by Robert Redford. He respectfully brought her up in every interview, as if he harbored an unsaid apology that he was never able to express. Because Robert Redford might not have developed into the person he is now if it weren't for Lola Van Vogenen. However, she vanished as soon as he rose to fame. Divorce wasn't a conclusion. For the remainder of his life, it was a question mark. Robert Redford once acknowledged that he was no longer the family guy after losing Lola Van Vogenen. He continued to be an A-list celebrity, appearing on award shows, and having hundreds of people lining up to get his signature. However, when he got home after each premiere night, nobody was there to greet him. Through memories that had never completely died, rather than romantic dates, he reconnected with Natalie Wood throughout those desolate years. Natalie Wood and Robert Redford had previously starred together in the films This Property is Condemned, 1966, and Inside Daisy Clover, 1965. He was a newbie at the moment, still trying to find her feet, whereas Natalie was already a shining star, lovely, melancholy, and possessing a quality that made others want to keep her safe. They were 2 lost souls on television. They didn't differ much off-screen. Natalie frequently spoke softly, smiled subtly, and occasionally sat in silence for hours on end without saying anything. Not because she was difficult to grasp, but rather because she always made Redford uncomfortable. But because he was afraid she would disappear if he touched her too deeply. If there was more going on between them, no one ever knew. They didn't ever go public. No controversy, no paparazzi. He only stood backstage for a long period a few times, watching her leave. She also left her scarf on a chair at one point. Redford held on to it. For eternity. Natalie Wood perished in 1981 while traveling with Christopher Walken and her husband, Robert Wagner. The press speculated ceaselessly, running hundreds of tales. Robert Redford, however, remained silent. He was not present at the funeral. He never showed up. As though he couldn't stand to see her name on one more headline. He just vanished. He was described as chilly by others, but sometimes the only way to hide sadness is to remain silent. Years later, he merely shook his head and glanced down when asked about Natalie. Nothing. That identical scarf, however, is reportedly still folded with care in a drawer in his Utah study. He never stayed long enough for him to hold on to Natalie Wood. So even though she wasn't the lady he had once held hands with in public, she was the one who haunted him the most. The fact that he never had the opportunity to tell her that she deserves far more love and that she is not as weak as she believes is possibly the most tragic aspect. The flame he dared not contain was Barbra Streisand. Barbra Streisand was the one who devastated Robert Redford because he let go. If Natalie Wood was the one who hurt him because he couldn't keep her. The Way We Were, which debuted in 1973, was a hit movie because of its heartwarming plot as well as how realistically they interacted on screen. As Katie, Barbra Streisand was strong, tenacious, and boundless in her love. Robert Redford was a stoic, collected, and sensible man who always kept his distance. At the conclusion, audiences sobbed. However, nobody realized that the conclusion also applied to them. Barbra Streisand freely acknowledged that she fell head over herself for Robert Redford because of his poise. Enthralled by those eyes that somehow always had something hidden. Redford, meanwhile, remained silent as usual, taking a step back without acknowledging or denying. He couldn't help but notice anything about Barbra. She spoke quickly, lived authentically, and loved without hesitation. She was fire. Her tears were genuine on set. Her touch was genuine. Her feelings were genuine. There were certain scenes that weren't even in the script. Were just Barbra, incapable of controlling herself. Redford once admitted that he turned away during the filming of a breakup scene in The Way We Were, but his eyes stung. It wasn't due of the character, he said. I knew that's why. In real life, I was losing this. He was already a legend thanks to Barbra Streisand. All she wanted was a man who would stick with her when the lights went out. Robert Redford, however, was unable to, or wouldn't. In the same way that he had lost his family to Hollywood, he was afraid that same feelings would overwhelm him and that he would lose control if he entered a relationship with a woman as fiery as Barbra. So he stepped back, and Barbra went away. But some people are only meant to stay with you in a movie, Barbra Streisand later said in a rare interview. Although we are still regarded as one of Hollywood's most romantic tales, Robert Redford didn't play the part. It was an opportunity to live truthfully. He lacked the bravery to take that opportunity. In the end, he might have been more troubled by all that might have occurred if he had the courage to love the way Barbra Streisand once did, rather than by what actually occurred. Braga, Sonia. The passion that threw him off balance. Sonia Braga was the storm Robert Redford voluntarily hurled himself into, only to discover he had no idea how to escape. If Natalie Wood was the memory he couldn't contain and Barbra Streisand was the fire he couldn't maintain. Their journey started in 1990 when Redford was 54 years old. He was no longer the lovable outlaw of Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, but he was still a living legend, tough and alluring enough to turn heads. And Sonia Braga, Brazil's most fiery actress, was once referred to as the Jane Fonda of South America. She was a free spirit who was not afraid to express her opinions, love whoever she wanted, and defy any stereotypes Hollywood tried to impose on her. Sonia had recently ended a tumultuous romance with director Clint Eastwood when they first met. She was bursting with energy and sexy in a straightforward, unvarnished manner. Redford, however, was accustomed to courteous, restrained ladies who talked a lot about art but kept their emotions to themselves. That was not Sonia Braga at all. She made him uneasy, but he was powerless to stop her for precisely that reason. A movie wasn't necessary for them to start dating. Just a few exchanged glances and bright afternoons. Robert Redford wasn't a filmmaker, a legend, or the man who had suppressed his emotions for all his life in order to maintain control in Sonia's arms. All he was a man who was loved. Additionally, Redford revealed something he himself never imagined he would say for the first time, according to a close acquaintance. I enjoy how she gives me a sense of helplessness. However, a stormy love cannot endure forever. She was too dazzling. He was too terrified. Sonia Braga once remarked after their split that Robert is like the mountain he lives on. You cannot live on top of him, even though you may admire him. Robert Redford was given something he had never had before, a quiet termination to a romantic relationship without a wedding or a boisterous aftermath. The sensation of rejection since he lacked the courage to fully love. He had always taken the lead throughout his life. However, he remained motionless this time and let her go. The woman was Jane Fonda. To love is to lose, not to love is to miss. The first time Robert Redford met Jane Fonda on the set of The Chase in 1966, he never anticipated this woman would remain in his life for nearly 50 years. Not as a lover, but as an unnamed longing. Jane Fonda was at her best at the moment. Brilliant, remarkably attractive, audacious, and idealistic. The moment she entered a room, she had the ability to silence everyone. However, Robert Redford was not dazzled like so many others. It did not enchant him. They warned him, because he recognized too much of himself in her. A lonesome spirit concealed by self-assurance, someone who bears too many scars, yet keeps them hidden from others. There was a profound resonance and respect between them, but no room at all for emotional blunders. Robert Redford was aware that his heart would never be whole again if he ever allowed it to fall love her. From Barefoot in the Park to Our Spirits at Night, they collaborated for almost 50 years. They were lovers on film, sharing a kiss as though everything had stopped. However, Robert Redford reverted to his true self, restrained, calm, and maintaining his distance when the director called cut. When he was by himself at night in his Utah house, he would think back to the way Jane looked at him while she was performing and silently think, if only. Jane Fonda had previously admitted that she loved Robert, but not in a way that could sustain a life. Regarding Robert Redford, he never declared his love for her, but he was the one who invited her each time they collaborated. Jane was the only one who knew that love wasn't necessary for him to flourish. All he needed was for it to exist. Jane Fonda unexpectedly started crying after a scene in the movie Our Souls at Night, which he was filming at the end of his life. I had no idea how important he was. I believed I still had time to get to know him further. But no, I was incorrect. Robert, did not respond. He only gave Jane's hand a squeeze, something he had hardly ever done for anyone in his life. It wasn't love at that moment. There was more to it. Because there are people we don't love out of fear of losing. We don't keep some folks because we know we'll never be able to. Additionally, some people are like shadows that move through our life. However, we can still see them there, more clearly than the others, every time we close our eyes. One such woman in Robert Redford's life was Jane Fonda, a love that never materialized but never vanished. Catherine Ross, the woman, right person, wrong moment. Catherine Ross troubled Robert Redford because he loved her exactly right, but at the wrong time. But Jane Fonda left him uneasy because he never loved her properly. They first crossed paths on the set of 1969's Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, a movie famous for its gaze on screen as much as its plot. Perhaps the only person to ever thaw that heartless outlaw's heart was Catherine Ross, the Sundance Kid's tender sweetheart. They never dated off-screen, and there were no scandals or admissions. However, the whole team acknowledged that they had a very genuine connection. There are women who make you feel softer, not because of desire, but because of the calm they carry with them, Robert Redford famously stated. He didn't have to play the hero when it came to Catherine Ross. During breaks, they would sit together and discuss trivial topics. Childhood memories, the scenery, and horses. Just presence, no chase. Basic yet profound. However, each went back to their own lives once the movie ended. At the time, Catherine Ross was in her second marriage, and Robert Redford was dealing with personal issues after losing a child. Fame and a failing marriage are starting to eclipse all individual decisions. Neither of them ever acknowledged loving the other, and they remained silent for years. However, Redford acknowledged in a private interview in the late 1990s that if he had been a different man in 1969, he might have chosen Catherine Ross. This isn't because there wasn't love, Rather, it's because some relationships, no matter how lovely, can't last when neither partner is completely themselves. Later on, Catherine Ross reconciled with Sam Elliott, a dependable and devoted actor. Redford had other relationships and had highs and lows, but he never brought up at a place again. However, if you've ever seen The Way We Were, you'll notice that Redford's character briefly smiles at an old flame before turning away in silence. There's a hint of Catherine Ross about that look. The look of an unrepentant guy who will always harbor a tiny part of his heart for the lady he will never be able to have. Meryl Streep, the one and only woman that ever scared him. Robert Redford was already a movie star when he first met Meryl Streep on the set of Out of Africa in 1984. But in some way, she made him feel insignificant. Neither because of age nor because of celebrity, but due to intelligence. Every eye followed Meryl Streep as she entered the set without making any noise or showing off. Redford had recently ended a marriage that had lasted about 30 years at that point. I've worked with many talented co-stars, but Meryl was the first who made me focus so intensely I forgot myself, he said in a rare interview. They lived together on the Kenyan plains, surrounded by the wind, sunsets, and silences that lasted longer than conversations, and they didn't only act in Out of Africa. Karen Blick's son, played by Meryl Streep, was a strong, lonely woman who yearned for love but resisted becoming possessed. Dennis Finch-Hatton, played by Robert Redford, was just himself, a free man who was elusive but constantly terrified of being alone. As a result, the story on television and the real one were nearly identical. As Redford once said, Meryl is more than just a character. She uses genuine emotion to analyze the character. Additionally, you can't hide in a performance while you're acting alongside her. You must be there. You must survive the entire filming process. They shared meals, went horseback riding, and even spent the evenings reading actual letters from Karen Blick's son around the campfire. Something persisted between them, but neither of them ever crossed the line. Unspoken but indisputable, Redford stayed out of the spotlight after the movie. Meryl Streep went back to her own life as a wife and mother, but they both showed complete respect for one another on the few times they spoke about one another. He's the type of man that inspires you to succeed and live a better life. Not for attention, but for yourself, Meryl once remarked. Additionally, Robert Redford, who is renowned for being restrained among women, once gave her a single line that was brief but left like a mark. Of all the ladies in Robert Redford's life, Meryl Streep is the one who would not allow me to lie to myself. He never even touched some of them, while others left him feeling remorseful and tormented. However, it wasn't until Meryl Streep showed him that true love doesn't necessarily require a relationship. Sometimes it's just a presence, strong enough to alter your perception of yourself. Alejandra Silva, to be tenderly cherished and let go. He was already over 80 when he met Alejandra Silva. By then, no one believed Robert Redford would love again, not even himself. And maybe that's exactly why there were no more expectations. He fell in love without having to prove it. Redford's life was not abruptly disrupted by Alejandra Silva, a Spanish social worker who was 41 years his junior. Be patient and gentle. Gentle. She loved a man who was tired of love, not a movie star. There was no noisy wedding, no grand declarations to the press, Robert Redford revealed in a rare 2018 interview, one of the few times he talked about his private life in public. They just shared a home in Utah, which he once referred to as his final haven, surrounded by snow, mountains, and the peace he had been seeking his entire life. At one point, Alejandro spoke of him with a loving glance. Even though he has more wounds than most people know, he doesn't harbor resentment toward them. He simply continues to live in silence. And I'm here not to alter him, but to walk beside him. Together, they read books, took care of the garden, and occasionally made an appearance at environmental events, but they avoided the spotlight. Nobody needed to know how they lived, and nobody really did. Because love didn't need to be captured in pictures at 80. The few remaining days were all that had to be lived. Alejandra held his hand during his silent hospital visits and stayed by his side during his last years. The one who, when illness made it difficult for him to recognize the man in the mirror, encouraged him to choose silence over fame. And possibly, she was also the one who bestowed the last kiss on his forehead when Robert Redford breathed his final breath in Utah at 89. No long statement, no tears for the cameras. Alejandra shared just one message on social media. My beloved man has turned into the wind. In the past, Robert Redford has strolled with some of the most powerful ladies in his generation. Meryl Streep, proud yet tender. Jane Fonda, insightful and mysterious. Catherine Ross, warm but hurt. And Natalie Wood, fierce and delicate. In the end, though, he settled on a woman who made him feel calm rather than agitated. Maybe at 89, he needed someone, not a tremendous love, who led him to receive little affection. Robert Redford spent his entire life surrounded by women who inspired admiration in everyone. Yet the more he loved, the more he understood. It's not necessary to hold on to every love. Others came to support him throughout his last winters, others to teach him the value of loss, and some to give him hope. Being in love with him was never simple. Silences without names were left behind. He had farewells that never really ended and sorrows too deep for words. But he was never resentful or bitter. Robert Redford cherished the way he made movies, quietly, tenaciously, occasionally failing, but always with empathy. People recalled him as a social activist, a patient spouse, a silent lover, a broken parent, and a movie star when he passed away at the age of 89. Above all, though, he served as evidence that, with enough self-compassion, a heart can learn to love again after numerous breaks. He once remarked, "To love someone is not to cling to them, but to learn how to love them without losing yourself." We no longer need to view him as a monument now that his life is over, but rather as a guy who once had a great love, once endured pain, and ultimately received forgiveness from life itself. Please write R.I.P. Robert Redford as a final farewell to the guy who lived and loved with all of his possessions if you have ever admired him. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you won't miss the next passionate, unforgettable stories of the legends you admire.